We've reached the section of the course now where we're going to start learning about some of the more advanced object-oriented features of C#. The information in this part of the course is going to build on the information that we learned about earlier in the chapter on creating custom classes and objects. Go ahead and watch that content if you haven't already, and then pick it up here. We're going to start with method overloading. And method overloading is when you define methods that have the same name but different ways of calling them. So let's look at a real example. Let's go back to our ubiquitous wine class example. And you can remember from earlier examples, I've got a class here called wine. And I can declare some member variables like year, name, and price, as I've done in the past. And you've probably seen me do something like this, where I declare a constructor function called wine, which is the same name of the class. And in this case, it takes a string argument, and it sets the value of the name variable to whatever argument was passed in. That's great, but what if I also wanted to give people that are using this class a way to initialize the class or construct the class with both a name and a year? Well, I could simply just define another wine constructor function like this. In this case, I've got a wine constructor, which takes a string and takes a year. You might be saying, well, wait a minute, you've already got a constructor function called wine. Isn't this a problem? Aren't you redefining something? No, not really. What I'm doing here is I'm overloading the wine constructor. And this doesn't just work with constructors. You can do this with any function. I just happen to be doing it with the constructor function here. And the reason this works is because the signatures of the two methods are different. In other words, the parameters that each one of these constructors takes is unique. So for consumers who wanted to call the constructor for the wine class using just a name, they can do that. If they want to use both a name and a year in their code, they can do that too. As long as you define the function with the same name and a different set of parameter list, that's fine. That's legal C#. Let's take a look at an example that doesn't work. If I have a class and I wanted to provide two functions of the same name, here I've got a function that takes an integer and returns an integer, and I've got another function that takes an integer but returns a float. The problem is this is an error. The return type of the function is not part of the signature. It's the parameter list. These methods are not considered different by the compiler. And you can imagine in the code, I would call the function with an integer argument. The compiler wouldn't know which one to call. So you can't do this. You can't have functions that differ only by the return type. The parameter list has to be different. So let's take a look at some real code to see how this works. So in the method overloading example, I've got my program open, and here's my snippets code, and I've scrolled down to the overloading method section. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this entire class right here for wine. And we're going to need this to set up the example. So I'll just copy this in, and I'll put it above the program class. Before I copy the rest of the code, let's take a look at what's going on here. I have my wine class, and I've got my member variables here. And then I've got a set of constructors. You can see that I've got a constructor for the wine class that takes just a string. I've got one that takes a string and a year. And I've got one that takes a string, a price, and a year. So I've got three different constructor functions. So I'm overloading this function 3 times. Okay, now let's go back to the snippets, and let's copy in some code that actually exercises this. I'm going to copy that and put it into the main function. And we'll just put it in right there. You can see here, starting on line 35, I'm creating 3 wine objects, W1, W2, and W3, and I'm calling the constructor in a different way each time. For W1, I'm just passing in a string representing the name. For W2, I've got a name and a year. And for W3, I've got the name, the price, and the year. And then I've got 3 lines here that's going to write out the various parts of the objects. So for wine 1, I'm going to write the name and so on. Just go ahead and try this code out and see what happens. So you can see that when I run the code, for W1, I'm writing out just the name. For W2, I have the year and the name. And for W3, I've got the year, the name, and the price. Now, because I've overloaded these functions, I can call them with different values and different parameters. So for example, I've given the consumers of this class 3 different ways to build their wine class objects. So just the name and the year, and the name, the year, and the price. If I wanted to go back and change the way that I constructed W1. I can put my cursor in here, type comma, and you can see that when I type the comma, C# Express gives me a little pop-up that says, hey, there's 3 different ways you can call this function. You can see right here it's on number 2 of 3, but I can cycle through all of these. 1 of 3 is to call the wine constructor with just a string. Here's the version with just a string and an integer. And you can see since I put the comma in there, it's highlighting the integer in bold saying, hey, that's what I think you're going to type next. Or in the third case, I've got the string, the price, and the year. And again, I'm on parameter number 2 right now, so it assumes I'm going to type a price in here. But the point is that C# Express is looking at my constructor list and helping me choose the one that I want, and it's showing me what's available. I can choose to use either this version or this version. So let's go ahead and use the second version. I'm going to just type in 2007. I need to change the console.writeLine as well. So I'll put this in here, w1.name. And now I'll do w1.year. And when I save and I rerun this, you can see I've got the name and the year that's being written out. Just to recap, overloading a method is when you declare a method with the same name, but with a parameter list that's different each time. In this example, I showed you how to do it with the constructor, but you can do this with any methods. It doesn't have to be the constructor. You can't do this with properties. You can't do this with fields. You can do this with methods.